I'm Charlie Campa, Otter Tail County Veterans Service Officer. Today we're going to take a little stray away from talking about VA benefits for veterans, dependents, and survivors. Please come into our offices to discuss just those at 118 North Main Street in New York Mills, 385-5540, and in Fergus Falls, 505 South Court Street, 998-8605. I want to thank Park Region TV for allowing me to do the Otter Tail County Veterans Show, but you're about to embark on a journey, a virtual tour of one of the most fascinating places I have ever seen, and we've got it right here in Otter Tail County in Battle Lake. Jay Johnson will show you around the historic Prospect House and the Civil War Museum. Thank you for joining us.
Tail County was the last survivor of his 1,000-man regiment. He was shot twice during the Civil War on Sherman's march to the sea. When he came here in Battle Lake in 1882, he built the first house in town. Then he added the first tourist hotel in the area to it. And then later on he built the first cabin on Battle Lake. He was mayor of Battle Lake and justice of the peace. He ended up being one of the 2 oldest men in Otter Tail County when he died, and he delivered the very first Montgomery Ward's catalogs ever printed. They called him Cap, Captain James A. Colo. And if you want to follow me, I'll show you the first house in town right here. If you stand right in here somewhere, you can see that blue house down there in the distance with the white trim on it. That's the first house in Battle Lake. My great-grandfather built that house in 1882 when he came here from Chicago. And then this sign over here, when you get around to it, this sign for part of my walking tour shows this house in 1890. And if you want to come on over here so you can get a quick look at it. And then that pretty much explains a lot of the history in town right here in this one picture. That's my great-grandfather, Cap Colauer. This is this place here in 1890. He built the first house in Battle Lake in 1882. 4 years later, he added the first tourist hotel in the area where the tourists would come to fish and swim and enjoy the lakes. Then in 1929, his daughter, my grandmother, and her husband remodeled the old hotel into that fancy home, and they took the first house in town off and they moved it down there. These are tourists in the picture here, and that's the lawnmower. He built that old house behind you there in 1902 so he wouldn't have to stay in the hotel with the guests anymore, and that's where I live over there. And then I do have this whole walking tour here, but I'm sure you'd probably rather see some of the inside stuff, but that gives you kind of the basics for the story. Well, come on in. When the house was remodeled in 1929, that little building there was my mother's playhouse when she was 7 years old. The ice house and stable were back there where the garage is now. Where that little building is, originally there was another small building that was called the Mangle Room. People would go in there and never come out whole again. You know what a mangle is? It's kind of like a giant wringer washer for wringing the water out of the clothes. But if you got your arm in there, it would be mangled. And come on in. "22 years ago, I found a chest on the 3rd floor of this house with nearly 200 Civil War letters in it, and then I started to find Civil War things all over the house. One of the first letters I found of the Civil War that my great-grandfather had written said that he was part of the mounted infantry, and that drove me crazy for a while, because you were either a foot soldier on foot or you're a horseback rider and you're in the cavalry. But it turned out he was part of the 1st Special Forces in the U.S. military, Wilder's Lightning Brigade of Mounted Infantry. Turns out he had a very fascinating Civil War history story. He wrote this himself up here. Can you get a picture of that? Union forever, Kohlauer. He fought to preserve the Union. That's why he volunteered to fight 3 years in the Civil War for $13 a month to go without food, sleep in the mud, freeze to death, and kill people. I think I'd find a better job. And come on in. This is Cap Kohlauer's Civil War collection and story in here that I put together in the last 20 years. In the corner over here is the map that shows where he was in the Civil War. That's Cap, my great-grandfather. He and his brother David enlisted together right there in Mount Carroll, Illinois, just down the river from St. Paul, Minnesota. They went east to Rockford, Illinois, got on the train and headed farther east, got off the train and headed south. They got on the riverboat and went down the Ohio River. They went by Fort Donelson, where General Grant had just had his first major victory, and the arms and legs were still sticking out of the ground, and the pigs were eating the bodies, and they could smell the stench a mile away. They both made it to Nashville, Tennessee, where David died of typhoid fever and Cap nearly died. He was in the hospital for 2 months. When he got out of the hospital, he joined the Lightning Brigade. He got his horse, his McClellan saddle, his Spencer repeater. He made it to Chattanooga, Tennessee in the Battle of Chickamauga, where he was shot through the right shoulder. Chickamauga is River of Death, was the bloodiest 2-day battle of the Civil War, with 35,000 casualties in 2 days. The bodies were piled so deep that the horses that were shot couldn't fall over, and they shot 10,000 horses in that battle. It was supposedly the bloodiest single day of fighting in U.S. military history. 1 out of 3 soldiers in that battle were killed, captured, or wounded. When he recovered from being shot through the right shoulder, he was shot through the left shoulder at Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Then back on the horse, fighting all the way, made it to Savannah, Georgia by Christmas of 1864. That's when he thought he might make it home from the war alive. Before that, he figured he was a dead man. Had his last battle at Chapel Hill, North Carolina, got on the train and headed home. Got back home almost exactly 3 years to the day from when he volunteered to fight in the Civil War. Some vacation. When he started out, he was in the infantry. And this is a copy of his infantry flag with a square end. He's marching on 2 feet under a 3-star general. Then when he started riding with Wilder's Lightning Brigade of Mounted Infantry, that's an oxymoron, he was a foot soldier on horseback, they started to use the cavalry flag of Kilpatrick's, which has got a notch on the end. It's called a guidon. He's on horseback under a 2-star general. This is a picture of Cap holding his Spencer, wearing that hat. He put his initials in the stock. This is his Spencer lever action repeater. You could call it the machine gun of the Civil War because you can shoot 20 shots a minute with that gun. Everybody else could only fire 2 shots back. He filed the spring down on it so it had a hair trigger. The bullets load through the stock, and they're worth $75 a piece, so I don't shoot it every day. The Spencer is the first rifle ever fired in combat underwater because it's the first one to use sealed cartridges. Everybody else had muzzle loaders. Because Cap could shoot 20 shots a minute with that Spencer rifle, they decided he really didn't need a bayonet. Nobody was going to get close enough to stab anyway, so they gave him a hatchet instead. They were called the Hatchet Brigade. Bayonets that fit on the end of a rifle were mostly used for cooking over the fire, candle holders, or tent stakes. They only stabbed people with them once in a while, and they had to eat every day. This is my great-grandfather's Lightning Brigade badge that I made this display out of. That's pretty cool stuff. Civil War shoes, brogans anyway, would fit either foot, and they only started to look like a right shoe after you wore them for a while. That's Cap's Civil War shoe, and it's very rare and very valuable. The soldiers wore them all out and threw them away. It was so valuable to Cap that when his house caught fire next door, he and Kate ran out of the house. Kate told him to go back in and save the silver. Cap went back in and got his shoe and his rifle and said to heck with the rest of it. This is the printing block that made this picture. Civil War uniform buttons have got letters in the middle, A, C, and I for artillery, cavalry, and infantry. His Civil War diary is open to one of the songs they were singing in camp, "Who Will Care for Mother Now?" And then they're going to go out and get killed the next day. I can't imagine people singing songs like that. This is David's sword, Cap's brother's sword. They enlisted together in the Civil War. David was elected lieutenant by his men, and his men chipped in together and bought David that sword. 9 months later, David was dead. Cap sent that sword home with David's body. Hiram, another brother, came and picked up the sword and the body, headed home, caught typhoid fever himself, and died 2 weeks later. The blue stuff on the handle is shark skin, made from the skin of a shark. It's very tough stuff, and it's grippy when it's wet. The sword is all engraved. It's made by Ames Manufacturing of Chicopee, Massachusetts. And they also made the swords for the Confederates. They didn't believe in discriminating against money. This sword is dull. You couldn't cut yourself with it if you wanted to. None of them were sharp. They were all dull. They're made for stabbing, breaking bones, or leading a charge, and only officers carry them on horseback. A cavalry saber is just as dull as this sword is, and the only real difference between a saber and a sword is a saber is curved and a sword is straight. And basically, if they were sharp, there'd be more injuries in camp than there would have been in battle. 88% of the injuries and death in battle in the Civil War were caused by bullets, 8% were caused by cannons, and only 4% were caused by swords, bayonets, knives. I got kicked in the head by a horse, or whatever. It was all about bullets. This is the dog tent that he was sleeping in Atlanta when he was burning the town down with Sherman in 1864. They were so small that if you wanted to turn over, you had to crawl out, turn over, and then crawl back in the other way. The soldiers hated them. He sent that shawl home from the Civil War for his mother. She was a Quaker and always wore black. Real Confederate money is hand cut with scissors. A Confederate $5 bill was worth $5 in gold if you won the war. If you lost the war, it was scratch paper. When Lincoln was shot, they found a Confederate $5 bill in his pocket. Cap's sister Susan made that doily during the Civil War while she was waiting for her brothers to come home. Cap came home standing up. David came home underneath that burial shroud. This is probably one of the more important displays. My great-grandfather's sleeves to his uniform, with bullet holes in each shoulder where he was shot, the Bible that he was carrying when he was shot, letters that he got when he was in the hospital with typhoid fever in Nashville, his nurse, Mick Roberts from Ohio, and a bottle of typhoid fever serum. They're kind of hard to find these days. This letter here says, "Blood from wound received at Muscle Shoals." That's my great-grandfather's blood on that letter when he was shot through the left shoulder. I've got his DNA in 2 places. The GAR is the forerunner of the VFW. Grand Army of the Republic is a reunion of Civil War soldiers. And when Cap died, the GAR died. You can't have a reunion with no one there. He was the last Civil War survivor in Otter Tail County. And that was the flag that was on his casket for his funeral. He died Christmas Day, 1938. One of the 2 oldest men in Otter Tail County. This picture here is David, Cap's brother David, the one that died in the Civil War in Nashville in 1863. He was a lieutenant. That's the belt and buckle that goes with that sword. His brother-in-law, Hector Jacobson, married to his sister Susan, he died in the bed on the 3rd floor of this house. October 16th, 1886, and he was a sergeant, and that's his sergeant's belt and buckle up there, We found this gravestone totally unexpectedly buried behind the garage, face down underneath 6 inches of dirt. Turns out, however, that Hector is actually buried in the cemetery by the school 3 blocks away. And my great-grandfather had taken the original stone down, buried it back there, never told anybody about it, and put up a fancier stone at Hector's grave. Civil War cannonballs. The little silver one is a 6-pounder. They're the most common cannonball used during the Civil War. They used more of them than any other kind, and they'd aim low on purpose so they could break legs and more legs and more legs. 75% of the surgeries in the Civil War were amputations. If you got hit with anything, they just cut it off. If you were wounded in any part of your body, and whether good, bad, or serious wound, you only had 1 chance in 7 of living. Civil War binoculars were made in Germany. Cap sent that violin home from North Carolina in 1864. That's a gunpowder keg. Back here in the corner is a Lincoln collection that my great-grandfather and my grandmother saved. There's a lot of cool things in this collection. A 1909 newspaper commemorating Lincoln's 100th birthday, 1938, about the plot to steal Lincoln's body. Here's a piece of Lincoln trivia that everybody should know and hardly anybody does. The statue of Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. was carved by a deaf sculptor, and the sculptor carved Lincoln's hands, so he's making the letters A and L in sign language. You can call him Al if you want. Here's another thing. You know, we do a lot of school tours here. We do 13 area schools now, and we're set up to teach Civil War history to all the 5th and 6th grade schools in the state. But there's a lot of interesting facts to learn about in the Civil War, and some of them aren't taught. But everybody thinks about the Civil War when their uniforms, they were blue and gray, blue and gray. It's all about the blue and the gray. Well, actually, it turns out the most common color of the Southern uniform is not gray. It's butternut, a color about like that, because they could make the dye at home out of butternut shells. And I looked up the butternut tree in my tree book. And in my tree book, it says Southern soldiers were called butternuts. Cap's regiment, the 92nd Illinois, had this very nice silkscreen flag right here. They called themselves the Butternut Crackers. This is the flag that his sister Susan made for him in 1862 when he headed off to war. It's getting pretty fragile. He brought a buddy of his into a Confederate home in Barnwell, South Carolina, with the back of his head shot off. His buddy died, and Cap took those 3 items in the corner of the display case from that Confederate home in payment for his buddy's death. Cap wrote on everything so he'd know his story. I was wounded here, September 19th, 1863. He was shot through the right shoulder right there at Brotherton House, Chickamauga. He lay there all night long, and then one of his buddies came by the next day with a canteen that was half full of mud. Cap drank it and said it tasted great. Then he lay there another day, and then finally Dr. Helm, after 2 days, got around to him. Dr. Helm took a rag, soaked it in kerosene, and pulled it through the bullet hole and out the back. Told Cap to go to the rear. I could do that kind of surgery. So Cap hopped on his horse and headed off to Winchester, Tennessee. That probably saved his life, because 2 hours after he left the hospital zone, it was overrun by the Confederates, and all the wounded Union soldiers that were there were captured and thrown into Andersonville, the Confederate prison camp where 13,000 soldiers died of malnutrition and disease, and he lost some of his good friends there. Luckily, Dr. Helm, he'd been captured too, but he'd gotten out on a prisoner exchange. So when Cap was shot again 4 months later through the left shoulder, he was surprised to see his old friend Dr. Helm there. Dr. Helm was surprised to see him there. Dr. Helm took a rag, soaked it in kerosene, and pulled it through that bullet hole. And he told my great-grandpa, he said, "Boy, you'd better get yourself home on furlough and stay there. You're gonna get yourself killed." But he healed up and went back to fighting again. He couldn't get out of that war. And his toenails became infected and they pulled his toenails out. And he about got shot again when a bullet went through his saddle when he was diving behind a tree. They say they lit the rag on fire to cauterize the wound at the same time. Might as well have a lot of fun all at once. That's that drum right there. That's my great-grandfather. That's the first Civil War reunion in Battle Lake in 1886. They had rules for this encampment. General Order Number 5, any comrade or citizen using vulgar language is to be tied and drawn twice across the lake by his feet. And that's with a rowboat. Bring some soap. This is the original letter with his blood on it right here. I brought this booklet of letters to the Antique Roadshow in Bismarck in 2014, and they said it was so valuable they couldn't even give me an estimate on it. Cap wrote on everything. Kilpatrick's cavalry raid around Atlanta. He wrote, "Poor account. I was there." He liked this one better. This is part of our teaching program for the schools here. It shows the timeline of the Civil War story in relation to Minnesota and to Battle Lake and Otter Tail County. This book here, Blue Lightning, all about the Lightning Brigade, one of the three most famous brigades in the Civil War, along with Custer's Cavalry and Berdan's Sharpshooters, has got my great-grandfather quoted in it. Everywhere there's one of those tabs. I crossed here in 1862. Good photo, Dad. He's got a great Civil War book collection. This one here is a must-read for everybody in this area. Uncle Tom's Cabin in Norwegian. That's Cap's record player, and the song on it is March Through Georgia, the most hated song in the South. Well, there's an awful lot more I could tell you about. I could go on for a couple hours. I guess if you have any questions or if you'd like to tell me more about it, I certainly could. But I'd highly recommend taking a tour of the museum. I think you'd enjoy it.
How about your hours of operation?
We're open right down during the summer. We're open 7 days a week, only in the afternoon on Sunday. We've got regular tour times. It takes about an hour and a half really to see the museum, and people usually like to spend every minute of it in here. The tour times are 10:30, 12:30, 2, and 3:30, and it's best to call in advance during the summer. We do get booked up quite often.
Is there a fee for that?
Yeah, normally we charge, we always charge $8 for adults and $5 for students. And we always appreciate tips and donations. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and so it's pretty much everybody is a volunteer here, including myself.
Where were you born?
More or less right here. I graduated from Battle Lake High School in 1966, but I was one of the last people to be born in Wright Hospital in Fergus Falls before they tore it down. Now it's the parking lot for Otter Tail Power. That's not a very good legacy. I was born in that parking lot. No, I'm pretty much a lifelong resident of Otter Tail County, and I've been doing tree work for 40 years, ran my own tree business. I planted over 2 million trees in the area. I've been a full-time logger. I made maple syrup for 20 years. I fought forest fire in Idaho and California. In Montana, cutting down trees on fire on a mountainside at night is an interesting job. If you're looking for excitement, I'd recommend it. And thank you. And I'll show you some more upstairs if you'd like. This is the living room as it looked in 1929 when my grandfather, Ernest Wilkins, inherited some money from his father's death, and he spent about half of the inheritance remodeling and refurnishing the old hotel, the old Prospect Inn. And then he lost most of the rest of the inheritance when the banks collapsed 2 years later. So we were rich for about 2 years, the way I've got it figured. My mother said we woke up the next morning and we were poor. She left me this property and I'm trying to recreate it, the history for her. She spent her whole life trying to preserve her family's home that she was born and died in, and I'm trying to carry out her wishes. I was the last of the family, and so this is kind of the culmination of my efforts here. The furniture is all from Dayton's and Minneapolis, back in the original locations. There's a picture of my grandmother sitting in that chair in that location. My parents were married right there in front of the fireplace in 1945, and the picture on the wall is still on the wall. That picture shows my grandfather sitting in that chair, Cap's son sitting in the wing chair, Cap's daughter, my grandmother, sitting next to him. Basically, I'm trying to recreate the history. That's what history is all about. It's about the story, and this is our family's story. 99% everything you see here in the museum is family things that were found right on this property, basically family memories. My dad raised golden retriever hunting dogs. That's how my mom and dad met. He raised a national field trial champion golden retriever, the best retriever in the nation 1 year, came from here. My mother's artwork is all over that she painted here and at the Minneapolis School of Arts. And the whole house is very interesting, and each room has got particular stories that go along with it. I'd highly recommend you take a tour of the museum. My family went to the World's Fair in Chicago in 1933. That's where our family came here from in 1882. My mother was 11, her brother, older brother and parents, my grandparents, went there. These are all 1933 World's Fair souvenirs from Chicago. It's called a Century of Progress because Chicago was started 100 years earlier in 1833 at Fort Dearborn. And this is a picture of Fort Dearborn on a wooden postcard that my mother sent home from the World's Fair in Chicago in 1933. And on the back of this wooden postcard, my mother tells about how she's sending home Andy. This is Andy. Andy was a live painted turtle that she bought at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1933. And she sent it home on the train for her grandparents to take care of until she got home. Then she was going to have it for a pet. On this postcard, my 11-year-old mother says, "Dear Cap and Grandma, did you get my turtle? Please feed it cracker crumbs." Well, it turned out this paint was poisonous to these young turtles, and Andy died on the train ride home. But his head is still sticking out the other end, and this family wouldn't want to throw away a perfectly good dead turtle, so we saved that too. I wonder how many people have got one of them. Well, you just step back 100 years. Everything in this room is from the 1800s, and it's all my great-grandparents' things. I'm winding their grandma's clock right now. This is actually a little newer. This is from 1924, but they passed away about 1940, so that was one of their things. The bedroom set, the washstand, the bed, and the dresser were given to Cap and Kate for their wedding in 1872. And that is their wedding certificate right there. Everybody thinks it's pretty cool because it's so big. Kate had a hand-painted feather fan. She was an artist. She painted the water scene, the deer, the hobo, and the stag picture back there. This is one of the more remarkable things, I think. It's not really my kind of thing, but this is a picture of Kate when she was a teenager. She was born in 1850. And she got this Valentine in this box in 1867. That's a 150-year-old Valentine in the original box. Only my family could save a cardboard box for 150 years. In 1876, my great-grandfather carved the date on the front of this piece of furniture that he made for his wife, and he made the matching chair for himself in 1876. He was a cabinet maker, the son of a cabinet maker. His father was born in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and made furniture just outside of Philadelphia. All of this furniture in the looking glass came here from Chicago in 1882 by train and horse and wagon. Cap was only 5'6", and everybody probably was about 6 inches shorter back then. But he made that chair for himself, and you were down in the Civil War Museum. You saw the rest of the story. The arms on that chair are different than normal. If you remember, Cap was shot through both shoulders, and it made him easier for him to get up. Kate's dresser with her things on it. There's fascinating things all over the house. Many things that you'd like to know about or you'd find interesting. Shoe horns were made out of cow horns back then. And that's why shoe horns are called shoe horns. That's the rifle he shot his last buck with. Stories go on and on. I'm happy to have you here. Come and check out a tour.
What are good relationships? What are they made of? At American Federal, the answer is people. The business of farming is a lot like a good sports team, working together for a common goal with the knowledge, commitment, and passion to get the job done. Whether it's sports or farming, American Federal knows good relationships come from good people, and that's something to really cheer about. Start a relationship today with Ag and Business bankers Mark Eifert and Chris Marvel at American Federal in Fergus Falls. Member FDIC.
Around here, we believe in local values like hard work, family time, or a fair price on reliable internet from a local company. That's why Park Region Telephone and Otter Tail Telecom delivers great local values, like a range of internet options to fit your family's needs. Fast and consistent enough to power everyone's devices at once. All at reasonable prices we're proud to offer our friends and neighbors. Ready for better internet? Give us a call or visit parkregion.com and discover our local values today.
I can tell you it's a great place to work. Everyone that you work with, it kind of becomes a family here.
I find joy and love in my work. I love my job.
I would definitely tell someone to apply at Pioneer. It's a good opportunity.
Pioneer Care, it's a family kind of feel when you come in. You know, they treat you good.
I can't imagine not working here. This is where my heart is, with people who we care for.
We do an important job, but we have a good time doing it. It's a fun crew. Best job in the world.